Ethan Morris worked 2 jobs to keep his daughter fed and never expected more than another exhausting day. But when an elegant older woman grabbed his wrist in a crowded café, everything changed. She stared at the crescent birthmark on his arm, the one he'd had since birth, and her eyes filled with tears. "This mark," she whispered, "it runs in our family." In that single moment, Ethan's entire life unraveled. He wasn't who he thought he was. The struggling single father had a past he never knew existed, connected to wealth and privilege beyond imagination. But would this discovery save him, or destroy the simple life he'd built for his little girl? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill beep cut through the darkness at 5:30 a.m., just as it did every weekday morning. Ethan Morris reached over and silenced it with practiced efficiency, careful not to disturb the small figure curled up on the other side of his bed. Olivia had crawled in sometime around 3, another bad dream about monsters she couldn't quite describe. At 7 years old, she still sought the comfort of her father's presence when the world felt too big and uncertain. Ethan eased himself out of bed, his back protesting the movement. The warehouse work took its toll, 43 years of age catching up with him faster than he cared to admit. He padded quietly across the worn carpet of their modest 2-bedroom apartment, navigating by memory in the pre-dawn gloom. The coffee maker was already set. He'd learned years ago that preparing the night before saved precious minutes in the morning rush. While the coffee brewed, Ethan stood at the kitchen window watching the city wake up around him. Their apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better days, but the rent was manageable, and Mrs. Kowalski next door was worth her weight in gold. The elderly widow had become something of a grandmother figure to Olivia, watching her after school when Ethan's warehouse shift ran late, never accepting more than token payment despite his insistence. The worn leather wallet on the counter caught his eye as he poured his coffee. Ethan picked it up, running his thumb over the cracked surface. Inside was a faded photograph of his mother, taken when she was younger than he was now. Her smile was genuine, but her eyes held something he'd only understood as an adult, a wariness, a constant vigilance. She died when he was 12, a sudden illness, the doctors said. Though looking back, he wondered if it had been more about giving up than giving in to disease. Next to her photograph was a single $20 bill, carefully folded. It was his emergency fund, pathetic as that sounded. But it had gotten them through more than one unexpected crisis: a forgotten school fee, Olivia's inhaler when insurance denied the refill, a tank of gas when payday was still 3 days away. Ethan replaced the wallet and moved to wake Olivia. She stirred as he gently shook her shoulder. Her dark curls, so like his own, spread across the pillow. "Time to get up, sunshine." "School day." She groaned but sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Is it Saturday yet?" "Not even close. It's Tuesday." "That's the worst day," she declared with the absolute certainty only a 7-year-old could muster. "At least Monday you're fresh." "Tuesday's just mean." Ethan smiled despite his fatigue. His daughter had a way with words, a brightness that shone through despite their circumstances. She noticed things, understood more than most kids her age. Sometimes he worried she'd inherited his mother's vigilance, along with her curiosity. The morning routine unfolded with choreographed precision. Olivia dressed herself while Ethan made breakfast. Oatmeal with a drizzle of honey, the cheap kind, but she never complained. Orange juice that was more water than fruit. But vitamin C was vitamin C, a multivitamin he crushed into her oatmeal when she wasn't looking because the pills were too big for her to swallow. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Olivia said between bites. "Always. Jessie at school says everyone has grandparents." "She has 4. "I don't have any." It wasn't quite a question, more of an observation waiting for confirmation or correction. Ethan set down his coffee. They'd had versions of this conversation before, but she was getting older, her questions more pointed. "Your grandma, my mom, she died before you were born." "I never knew my dad or any other family." "Why not?" My mom raised me by herself, just like I'm raising you. She never talked much about where she came from or who her family was. That's sad. Olivia's face scrunched up in thought. Didn't you ask her? I did, when I was about your age. She'd always change the subject, or say it didn't matter because we had each other. Ethan paused, remembering those conversations, his mother's practiced deflection. I think maybe it hurt her to talk about, so eventually I stopped asking. Do you miss her? Every day? Olivia nodded solemnly, then returned to her oatmeal. The conversation was over for now, filed away in that remarkable brain of hers, to be revisited later with new questions. Ethan had learned to appreciate these morning talks. They were honest in a way that afternoon chatter rarely was, before the world had fully woken up, before guards went up and social masks settled into place. By 7:15 they were out the door, Olivia's backpack slung over Ethan's shoulder as they descended the stairs. His truck was parked on the street, a 15-year-old Ford with more rust than paint, but an engine that refused to die. He'd bought it for $800 6 years ago, and it had been worth every penny, and then some. The drive to Olivia's elementary school took 12 minutes in morning traffic. She chatted about her upcoming project on ocean animals. She'd chosen sea turtles, and asked if they could go to the library this weekend to get more books. Ethan made a mental note. The library was free, and Olivia's love of reading was something he nurtured with quiet pride. Have a great day. Sunshine, he said as she unbuckled her seatbelt in the drop-off lane. You too, Dad. She leaned over and kissed his cheek, then was gone in a blur of backpack and enthusiasm. Joining the stream of children flowing toward the school entrance, Ethan watched until she disappeared inside, then headed to the warehouse. His shift started at 8, and the supervisor was a stickler for punctuality. The job wasn't glamorous, inventory management, forklift operation, loading dock coordination, but it was steady work with benefits. The health insurance alone was worth its weight in gold with Olivia's asthma. The day passed in the familiar rhythm of physical labor and logistical problem-solving. Ethan had worked his way up to shift supervisor over 5 years, earning respect through reliability and an unexpected knack for efficiency. He could see patterns in the chaos of shipping and receiving, optimize routes and workflows in ways that saved time and money. His boss had mentioned management training more than once, but the timing was never right. Training meant night classes, which meant less time with Olivia, which meant it wasn't happening. During his lunch break, Ethan sat in his truck and ate the sandwich he'd packed, peanut butter and banana. Olivia had made it this morning with extra peanut butter on his side, for energy. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his bank app, a ritual that never got easier. Checking account, $347. Savings, $89. Rent due in 5 days, $950. Paycheck hitting in 3 days would cover it with a little left over. But then there was the notice he'd received last week about the rent increase starting next month. Another $100 he'd need to find somewhere. The phone buzzed with a reminder, Olivia's prescription refill due tomorrow. He opened his insurance app and checked the coverage. Denied. Again. They'd been through this dance before. He'd call after work, spend 40 minutes on hold, eventually get transferred to someone who might actually help. Or he'd pay out of pocket and skip lunch for the rest of the week. The inhaler was non-negotiable. At 3:30, Ethan clocked out and headed to the school pickup line. Olivia emerged right on time, her face flushed with excitement. Mrs. Rodriguez said my sea turtle drawing was the best in class. That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of you. They stopped at the apartment long enough for Olivia to change and grab a snack. Then Ethan dropped her at Mrs. Kowalski's. I'll be back by 6:30, he promised. Take your time. Dear, Mrs. Kowalski said, her Polish accent still thick after 40 years in America. We're making pierogi. Olivia is learning to pinch the edges just right. The weekend handyman work was essential supplemental income. Today, it was fixing a leaky faucet and replacing some rotted deck boards for the Hendersons, a retired couple on the east side. They paid cash and always offered him dinner, which he politely declined more often than not. Taking charity, even kindly meant, stuck in his throat. By 6:15 he was done, $200 in his pocket and an invitation to come back next month for some gutter work. He collected Olivia from Mrs. Kowalski's. She thrust a container of pierogi into his hands, despite his protests, and they headed home. Dinner was the pierogi with a side salad, eaten at their small kitchen table, while Olivia told him everything about her day in exhaustive detail. Her teacher, her friends, the boy who ate glue during art class, the substitute lunch lady who gave bigger portions than the regular one. Ethan listened to every word, asking questions, laughing at her impressions, treasuring these moments of normalcy. After dinner came homework, math worksheets that Ethan checked carefully. Reading practice, where Olivia's skill delighted and humbled him in equal measure. Bath time, pajamas, teeth brushing, the mighty ritual of bedtime routine that gave structure to their lives. Finally, the best part of the day, reading time. They were working through a chapter book about a girl detective, and Olivia was completely invested in the mystery. Ethan read 2 chapters tonight because they ended on a cliffhanger, and Olivia's pleading eyes were impossible to resist. "Dad?" she said as he tucked her in. "Yeah, sunshine? We're okay, aren't we? Like we have what we need?" The question caught him off guard. "Of course we do. Why do you ask?" "I heard you on the phone yesterday. You sounded worried." Ethan smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Adults worry sometimes. That's part of the job. But you don't need to worry. I've got us covered. Promise?" "Promise." She nodded, satisfied, and snuggled deeper into her blankets. "Love you, Dad. Love you too, sunshine. Sweet dreams." He left her door cracked open, the hallway light providing a gentle glow, and retreated to his own room. The apartment was quiet now, just the hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed and pulled off his work boots, every muscle in his body aching. On his nightstand sat a small wooden box, one of the few possessions from his mother. Inside were a handful of photographs, his original birth certificate, or so he'd always believed, and a few pieces of costume jewelry. He opened it and looked at his mother's face in the photographs. "Young pretty, always with that guarded expression. Who were you really?" he asked the photograph. "What were you running from?" She'd been evasive about her past, changing the subject whenever young Ethan asked about grandparents or extended family. She'd moved them 3 times before he turned 10, always to new cities, new neighborhoods, new schools. He'd thought it was about money, about finding work. But looking back with adult eyes, it felt like something more. Like hiding, Ethan's gaze drifted to his wrist, to the small crescent-shaped birthmark he'd had since birth. It was distinctive, he supposed, but he'd never thought much about it. Just one of those quirks of biology. His mother had gone pale once when he asked about it, said it was just a birthmark and nothing more, said it with an edge to her voice that silenced further questions. He closed the box and set it back on the nightstand. These late-night reflections led nowhere productive. His life was what it was. Hard work, tight money, a daughter to raise right. That was enough. It had to be enough. But as Ethan lay in bed waiting for sleep to come, his mind kept returning to his mother's final days. The illness had come fast, burning through her like wildfire. In the hospital, delirious with fever, she'd gripped his 12-year-old hand and whispered, "Stay hidden, stay safe." He'd thought it was the fever talking, meaningless rambling. But now, in the darkness of his room, he wondered, had she been trying to tell him something? Had there been a reason for all the moving, all the secrets, all the careful anonymity of their lives? The questions followed him into uneasy sleep, where dreams of his mother's worried face mingled with Olivia's innocent questions about grandparents and family trees that had no roots to trace. The café was busy for a Tuesday morning, filled with the sounds of grinding espresso machines and muted conversations. Ethan normally didn't stop for coffee. It was an expense he couldn't justify, but his truck had started making an ominous rattling sound 3 blocks from the warehouse, and he'd pulled into the first parking lot he saw to investigate. The café happened to be next door, and after 20 minutes under the hood, tightening a loose heat shield, he figured he'd earned a cup before his shift. He stood in line, mentally calculating whether he could afford the $3.50 for a medium coffee when he felt someone staring at him. The sensation was unmistakable, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. He turned slightly and saw her, an older woman, perhaps in her mid-70s, elegantly dressed in a way that spoke of careful attention rather than flashy wealth. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, her posture straight despite her years. But it was her expression that caught him. Shock, recognition, something that looked almost like grief. Their eyes met across the café and she went pale. Ethan looked away, uncomfortable, and moved forward in line to order. He was just reaching for his wallet when he felt a hand on his arm, gentle but insistent. He turned to find the woman standing beside him, her fingers trembling against his wrist. "Excuse me," Ethan said, instinctively pulling back. "Can I help you?" "Your wrist," she whispered, her voice catching. May I see your wrist?" "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "Please," her eyes were filling with tears. "Just let me see." Something in her desperation made him comply. He held out his arm, and she pushed up his sleeve slightly, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark just above his wrist bone. The woman gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. She swayed slightly, and Ethan instinctively reached out to steady her. "Mom, are you all right? Do you need to sit down?" She nodded mutely, and Ethan guided her to a nearby table, aware that other patrons were watching. He pulled out a chair for her and she sank into it, never taking her eyes off his wrist. From her purse, she extracted a delicate handkerchief, the kind Ethan had only seen in old movies, embroidered with initials he couldn't quite make out. She dabbed at her eyes, composing herself with visible effort. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice steadier now. "I've given you quite a fright. My name is Evelyn Rothwell, Ethan Morris." He sat down across from her, completely confused. "Mrs. Rothwell, what's this about?" "That birthmark," she said, pointing to his wrist with a trembling finger. It's a family mark, very rare. It appears once in a generation, sometimes skipping several. I haven't seen it in over 30 years." Ethan's mouth went dry. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." "No," she shook her head firmly. "No mistake. My grandson had that exact mark in that exact place. Christopher." Her voice broke on the name. "He disappeared 32 years ago." The cafe noise faded to background static. Ethan stared at this woman, at her expensive clothes and her genuine distress, and felt his carefully ordered world beginning to tilt. "I don't understand what you're telling me." Evelyn Rothwell opened her purse again and withdrew a photograph, its edges worn from handling. She placed it on the table between them. The photo showed a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, smiling at the camera. His sleeve was rolled up, and there on his wrist was an identical crescent birthmark. "Christopher Rothwell was my grandson," Evelyn said quietly. 32 years ago, he disappeared along with his young wife. They had an infant son, barely 6 months old. The family searched for years. Private investigators, police, every resource we had. We found nothing. It was as if they'd vanished from the earth. Ethan's mind was racing. 32 years ago. He was 31. "That doesn't mean—" "How old are you?" 31. "And your parents?" "My mother raised me alone. She died when I was 12. Ethan heard his own voice, distant and hollow. "I never knew my father." Evelyn's hand covered her mouth again, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She looked at him with such intensity that he had to resist the urge to get up and leave. "Your mother's name?" "Caroline Morris. Did she ever mention another name? Did she ever talk about her past, about family?" Ethan thought of all the deflected questions, all the times his mother had changed the subject or grown distant when he asked about grandparents or relatives. "She never talked about her past. We moved a lot when I was young. She was careful, private. She was hiding." Evelyn said it with certainty, not accusation. "Christopher's wife was named Caroline Ashby before she married him. She came from a working-class background and—" She paused, pain crossing her features. "The family wasn't kind to her. We thought she wasn't suitable, that she was after Christopher's money. We were wrong about so many things. This is impossible." But even as Ethan said it, pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. His mother's paranoia about their privacy, her refusal to keep photographs or documents, the way she'd taught him to be forgettable, to not draw attention. Even if any of this were true, you can't know I'm connected to your family just from a birthmark. You're right. Evelyn composed herself, dabbing her eyes once more with the monogrammed handkerchief. I'm allowing hope to override reason. But would you consider taking a DNA test? I would pay for everything, of course. If there's no connection, then I apologize for disturbing you. But if there is, then what? Ethan heard the edge in his own voice. What exactly are you hoping for, Mrs. Rothwell? The truth. She met his eyes steadily. And perhaps, if you are Christopher's son, a chance to know my great-grandson. To be part of his life if he'll allow it. Ethan stood abruptly. I need to get to work. Please. Evelyn reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, placing it on the table. Take this. Think about what I've said. There's no pressure, no obligation. But if you change your mind, if you want to know the truth, call me. He looked at the card. Thick, expensive cardstock. Evelyn Rothwell. A phone number. Nothing else. His hand moved almost of its own accord, picking it up. I had a life, he said quietly. My mother and me. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. If what you're saying is true, if she ran from your family, she had reasons. I know. Evelyn's voice was thick with emotion. I know she did, and I don't blame her for protecting her child. I just want a chance to make amends, if that's possible. To know the truth about what happened to Christopher. Ethan pocketed the card and looked at this woman who claimed to be his family. She seemed genuine in her grief and her hope. But his mother's dying words echoed in his mind. Stay hidden, stay safe. I need time to think, he said. Of course. Take all the time you need. He left the cafe without ordering coffee, his mind churning. The truck started on the first try, the heat shield no longer rattling. He drove to the warehouse on autopilot, parked, and sat in the cab for 10 minutes before his shift started, staring at nothing. That evening, after Olivia was asleep, Ethan sat at his laptop, an ancient machine that took 5 minutes to boot up, and searched for Rothwell family. The results were immediate and extensive. Rothwell Industries, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, philanthropic foundations, society pages featuring elegant charity galas, and buried in the archives, 32-year-old news stories about a family tragedy. Christopher Rothwell, heir to the Rothwell fortune, missing and presumed dead. His wife Caroline and infant son also vanished. Case never solved. Ethan stared at the photograph of Christopher that accompanied one article. The resemblance was undeniable. The same dark curly hair, the same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes. He looked at the birthmark on his own wrist, then back at the screen where Christopher's identical mark was visible in one candid photograph. His mother's words came back to him. Words he'd dismissed as fever dreams. Stay hidden, stay safe. What had she been hiding from? And more importantly, was he still in danger if the truth came out? For 3 days, Evelyn Rothwell's business card sat on Ethan's nightstand, a constant reminder of the conversation that had upended his understanding of himself. He went through the motions of his daily routine, work, pick up, dinner, bedtime, but his mind kept returning to that café, to the photograph of Christopher Rothwell, to the unmistakable birthmark they shared. On the 4th day, he knocked on Mrs. Kowalski's door after dropping Olivia at school. The elderly woman welcomed him with her usual warmth, pouring tea without asking if he wanted any. They sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by photographs of her late husband and the children who rarely visited anymore. You look troubled, Ethan, she said in her accented English. Something weighs on you. He told her everything. The encounter at the cafe, Evelyn's claims, the research he'd done late at night. Mrs. Kowalski listened without interruption, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup, her expression thoughtful. Your mother, she said when he finished. She was frightened woman, yes? Always looking over shoulder? Ethan blinked. You knew my mother? No, but I know the look. I see it in old photographs you show Olivia. And I see it sometimes in you when you think no one watches. She reached across the table and patted his hand. This woman, this Evelyn, she offers you answers. Perhaps answers you need. But what if the answers are worse than not knowing? My mother ran from these people for a reason, perhaps. Or perhaps she ran from circumstances, not people. You cannot know until you ask questions. Mrs. Kowalski's eyes were kind but firm. You teach Olivia to be curious, to seek truth. Do same for yourself. It could change everything. Our lives, Olivia's future, or it changes nothing except you finally know where you come from. Knowledge is not obligation, Ethan. You take tests, you learn truth, then you decide what to do with it. You are good father, good man. This will not change. That afternoon, during his lunch break, Ethan called the number on the card. Evelyn answered on the second ring, her voice careful, hopeful. Mr. Morris, I hoped I might hear from you. I've been thinking about what you said. About the DNA test. He paused, watching warehouse workers load a truck across the parking lot. If I agree to this, I need to set some conditions. Of course, anything. The results stay private. No media, no announcements, nothing public, until I decide what I want to do with the information. And if there's no match, we part ways, and that's the end of it. Agreed. He could hear the relief in her voice. I'll arrange everything. A private medical office, complete discretion. Would tomorrow work?
I have to work tomorrow.
Saturday morning? Saturday is perfect. I'll text you the address. After he hung up, Ethan sat in his truck for the remainder of his lunch break, staring at his phone. He'd crossed a line, moved from observer to participant in whatever this was. The thought both terrified and compelled him. That evening he almost told Olivia. The words were right there, ready to explain that they might have family after all, that her questions about grandparents might finally have answers. But he swallowed them back. No point in raising hopes or fears until he knew for certain. Saturday morning arrived grey and drizzly. Ethan dropped Olivia at Mrs. Kowalski's. They were baking cookies, Olivia's favorite weekend activity, and drove to the address Evelyn had provided. It was a medical building in an upscale part of the city, the kind of place that screamed discretion and money. Evelyn was waiting in the lobby, dressed more casually than their first meeting, but still with that air of careful elegance. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. The test itself was anticlimactic. A technician swabbed the inside of his cheek, labeled the sample, and explained that results would take approximately 2 weeks. Ethan signed paperwork that felt more extensive than his apartment lease, ensuring privacy and limiting liability. Afterward, Evelyn invited him to a small café across the street. "Just for coffee," she said. "No pressure. But if you have questions, I'm happy to answer what I can." They sat by the window, rain streaking the glass, and Ethan found himself asking the question that had haunted him since their first meeting. "Why did your family disapprove of Caroline?" "My mother." Evelyn's expression grew pained. "We thought she was after Christopher's money. She came from nothing. Her father was a mechanic, her mother cleaned houses. Christopher met her at a community center where she was volunteering. He fell hard and fast." She stirred her coffee absently. "We didn't see her for who she was. We saw her background and made assumptions. Terrible, snobbish assumptions. What was she really like? I only met her a handful of times. Christopher brought her to family dinners, and she was quiet, watchful, kind certainly, but guarded around us. I thought it was because she was intimidated by the money. Now I wonder if she simply saw us clearly and knew we judged her unfairly." "Tell me about Christopher," Ethan said. About him?" Evelyn's face softened. He was gentle, thoughtful. He loved classical music and old books, spent hours in the library rather than at business meetings. His father, my son, died when Christopher was 15, and there was enormous pressure on him to take over the family business eventually. But he wasn't built for corporate warfare. He wanted to teach, to write, to live quietly. That doesn't sound like someone who'd just disappear. "No," Evelyn's voice dropped. "It doesn't. The police investigated, of course. Christopher's car was found abandoned near the river 3 days after he was last seen. No body, no note, no evidence of foul play. They ruled it a possible suicide or accident. But Christopher wasn't suicidal. He was happy with Caroline, thrilled about the baby. Something happened, something that made them both run, or she couldn't finish the sentence, or something worse, Ethan completed quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 32-year-old grief and mystery heavy between them. "The family business," Ethan said finally. "Who runs it now?" "My daughter Patricia's husband, Gerald Sterling. He stepped in after Christopher disappeared, consolidated control. The company has been quite successful under his leadership." Something in her tone made Ethan pay attention. But nothing. "Gerald has been capable. Ruthlessly so, some say, but effective." She met his eyes. "I don't want you to think the family's perfect, Ethan. We have our complications like any family. Wealth doesn't solve problems. It often just makes them more complex." They talked for another hour, Evelyn sharing memories and family history, Ethan asking careful questions. He learned about the Rothwell fortune, built on manufacturing, diversified into real estate and technology, now worth billions. He learned about family dynamics, the pressure of legacy, the weight of expectations. When they finally parted, Evelyn squeezed his hand. "Whatever the test shows, I'm glad we met. And I hope you'll let me know either way." "I will," Ethan promised. He picked up Olivia from Mrs. Kowalski's, returned home to the smell of fresh cookies, and tried to feel normal. But as he watched his daughter chatter about the different types of cookies they'd made, he couldn't shake the feeling that normal was already gone, replaced by this strange liminal space where everything he'd believed about himself was waiting to be confirmed or denied. That night, he pulled out the wooden box from his nightstand again, looking at his mother's photographs with new eyes. Had she loved Christopher Rothwell? Had she run from danger or from disapproval? Had she spent 30 years looking over her shoulder, changing their names, moving them from city to city, all to protect a secret that had died with her? "What happened to you both?" he whispered to the photograph. "What were you so afraid of?" The photograph, as always, offered no answers. Only his mother's careful, guarded smile, hiding truths he was finally beginning to uncover. The waiting was harder than Ethan had anticipated. Each day felt longer than the last, his mind cycling through possibilities and consequences. At work, he caught himself staring at nothing, mentally calculating what a connection to the Rothwell family might mean. At home, he second-guessed every interaction with Olivia, wondering if he should prepare her for potential changes or shield her from uncertainty. On the 8th day, Evelyn called. "I have something I'd like to share with you, if you're willing. No pressure, but I thought you might want to see it before the results come back." They met at the same small café, and this time Evelyn brought a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. She handled it with reverence, placing it carefully on the table between them. "This was Christopher's," she said. "His personal journal. He kept it from the time he was 16 until he disappeared. I've read it more times than I can count, looking for clues about what happened. I'd like you to read it too." Ethan picked up the journal, feeling the weight of it in his hands. "Are you sure? If you are his son, then this is part of your inheritance. Not the money or the property, but this, his thoughts, his dreams, who he really was." Her eyes glistened. "And if you're not his son, well, perhaps it will help you understand why I hoped so desperately that you were." That evening, after Olivia was asleep, Ethan opened Christopher's journal. The early entries were what he'd expect from a teenager. Observations about school, frustrations with expectations, musings about music and literature. But as Christopher aged, the entries deepened, revealing a thoughtful young man increasingly at odds with the world he'd been born into. "I don't understand how father does it," Christopher had written at 19. "Every decision is about profit margins and market share. When I suggested we donate more to the community programs, he laughed. Said charity is fine for tax purposes, but business is business. Is that all we are? Just mechanisms for accumulating wealth?" Ethan found himself connecting with these words, with the frustration of feeling trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. He read late into the night, watching Christopher's evolution from dutiful son to questioning young man. The entries from Christopher's mid-20s were different, lighter, hopeful. The change coincided with a new name appearing in the pages. Caroline. I met someone today who doesn't care about the Rothwell name, Christopher wrote. She was volunteering at the community center, teaching kids to read. When I introduced myself, she asked what I did, not who I was. I told her I worked in business. Couldn't quite bring myself to explain the whole truth yet. We talked for 2 hours about books and education and what makes life meaningful. I haven't felt this alive in years. Ethan's throat tightened. This was his mother, Christopher was describing, young and idealistic. Before whatever happened had turned her into the cautious, fearful woman he'd known. Brought Caroline to dinner tonight, a later entry read. It was a disaster. Mother was coldly polite. Aunt Patricia barely spoke to her, and Uncle Gerald kept making pointed comments about knowing one's place. Caroline handled it with grace I don't possess. Afterwards, she said she understood that some families need time to adjust to change. But I saw the hurt in her eyes. They judged her before they knew her, and that's unforgivable. The entries continued, documenting Christopher's growing frustration with his family's treatment of Caroline, his increasing distance from the business, his dreams of a simpler life. Then came the entry that made Ethan's hands shake. Caroline is pregnant. We found out today, and I've never been happier or more terrified. The family will try to use this to control us. They'll want the child raised as a proper Rothwell, molded into their image. But I won't let that happen. I won't subject my son or daughter to the same suffocation I've endured. Caroline and I have been talking about leaving, starting over somewhere else. We have enough saved to survive for a while, and I can teach or write or do anything that doesn't involve board meetings and profit reports. Ethan closed his eyes, imagining his parents, because that's what they were, he realized, regardless of what the DNA test showed, planning their escape. He turned the page, eager to read more. Something's wrong. The past few weeks I've felt watched. Cars following me, phones clicking on the line. Gerald has been pressuring me about some business deal. Wants my votes on the board, says it's crucial for the company's future. But I've reviewed the documents and something doesn't add up. The numbers are too clean, the projections too optimistic. When I asked questions, Gerald got angry in a way I've never seen. Said I was being naive, that this is how business works. But I don't think he's being honest. The entries grew shorter, more urgent. Meeting with the family attorney tomorrow. Need to understand my options, how to protect Caroline and the baby if I go against Gerald's deal. He called tonight, made a comment about how family loyalty matters more than individual concerns. There was something in his voice, a warning. Caroline wants to leave now. She's frightened, says something feels wrong. I told her I need to secure a few things first, make sure we have enough money to disappear properly. But maybe she's right. Maybe we should just go. The final entry was dated 32 years ago, the day before Christopher disappeared. Tomorrow night. We leave tomorrow night. I've transferred what funds I could access discreetly, enough to start over. Caroline is packed, the baby is healthy. We're meeting at the cabin, then driving straight through to Canada. I'm leaving letters for Mother and the attorney, explanations, evidence about Gerald's deal, everything I've discovered. If I'm right about what he's doing, the authorities need to know. But first, I get my family to safety. Then I deal with the consequences. The journal ended there. No more entries. Ethan sat frozen, the implications washing over him. Christopher hadn't just disappeared. He'd been planning to expose something, to take evidence to authorities. And he'd never made it to that cabin where Caroline was waiting. The next morning, Ethan called Evelyn. I read the journal. All of it. Then you know he was planning to leave. I know he was planning to expose something about Gerald's business deal. What happened with that deal, Evelyn? There was a long pause. It went through. 2 days after Christopher disappeared, the board voted unanimously to approve it. Gerald assumed control of the company shortly after. That's convenient timing. I know how it looks, Evelyn said quietly. But Gerald was investigated along with everyone else. The police found nothing to suggest he was involved in Christopher's disappearance, or they didn't look hard enough. Ethan, I understand your suspicions. They mirror my own. But without evidence, Christopher said he was leaving evidence with the family attorney. What happened to it? Another pause. The attorney at that time, Mr. Whitmore, died 15 years ago. If Christopher left anything with him, it was never discovered. His files were reviewed during the investigation, and nothing relevant was found. Ethan gripped the phone tighter. My mother was waiting at some cabin. She was waiting for Christopher, and he never came. That's why she ran. She knew something had happened to him. Yes, Evelyn whispered. I believe that's exactly what happened. And I believe she spent the rest of her life protecting you from whatever or whoever prevented Christopher from reaching her that night. The DNA results, Ethan said. When do they come back? Any day now. But Ethan, regardless of what they show, you need to be careful. If your suspicions about Gerald are correct, then he's not going to be happy when I show up claiming to be Christopher's son. No, Evelyn agreed. He certainly won't be. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, certified mail, requiring Ethan's signature. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, standing in his apartment after Olivia had left for school. Inside was a single page of laboratory results, dense with technical language, but the conclusion was clear and unambiguous. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Christopher Rothwell was his father. Ethan sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the paper. All his life he'd been Ethan Morris, son of Carolyn Morris, nobody from nowhere. Now, in an instant, he was someone else entirely. Ethan Rothwell, heir to a fortune, connected to a family he'd never known existed. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. He called Evelyn. She answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. The results came, he said simply, and you were right. Christopher was my father. Her sob of relief came through clearly. Oh, thank God, thank God. Would you be willing to meet? There's so much we need to discuss. I need to tell Olivia first. She deserves to know before anyone else. Of course she does. That evening after dinner, Ethan sat with his daughter at their small kitchen table. He'd been rehearsing what to say all day. But now that the moment had arrived, the words felt inadequate. Sunshine, I need to talk to you about something important. Something that's going to change things for us. Olivia's eyes widened with the particular alertness children get when they sense adult worry. Are we moving again? No, nothing like that. It's about family, about where I come from. He took a breath. You know how you asked about grandparents? About why we don't have extended family? She nodded. I always told you I didn't know my father, and that was true. But recently I found out who he was. And he came from a very different kind of life than we have. Different how? His family has a lot of money, a lot. They've been looking for me for a long time, and they want to meet us. Olivia processed this with the peculiar logic of 7-year-olds. So we're rich now. It's more complicated than that. Yes, technically, there's money that belongs to me because of who my father was. But that doesn't mean everything changes overnight. We're still us. Can we get a dog? Despite everything, Ethan smiled. Maybe. Eventually. But first I need to meet the rest of the family and figure out what all this means. Would you be willing to come with me? To meet your great-grandmother? I have a great-grandmother? The wonder in her voice was pure and uncomplicated. Is she nice? I think so. Her name is Evelyn, and she very much wants to meet you. 3 days later, Ethan and Olivia drove through the gates of the Rothwell estate. Olivia pressed her face against the window, her eyes huge as they passed manicured lawns, formal gardens, and finally pulled up to the main house, a sprawling mansion that looked like it belonged in a historical drama. Dad, Olivia whispered. People actually live here? Apparently so. Evelyn was waiting on the front steps, and her face crumpled the moment she saw them. She composed herself quickly, but Ethan saw the emotion there, grief and joy and loss all tangled together. This wasn't just about him. He was the closest thing she'd ever get to having Christopher back, Ethan, and this must be Olivia. Evelyn crouched down to Olivia's level. I'm your great-grandmother. I've been hoping to meet you for a very long time. Olivia, usually shy around strangers, studied Evelyn with solemn curiosity. You have the same eyes as my dad, do I? Well, perhaps that's because we're family. We don't really know what that means yet, Olivia said with startling honesty. But Dad says you're nice. Evelyn laughed, a sound of pure delight. I will do my very best to live up to that assessment. The house interior was overwhelming. High ceilings, expensive art, furniture that looked too pristine to actually sit on. A staff member appeared to take their coats, which made Olivia giggle nervously. Ethan felt profoundly out of place in his work khakis and button-down shirt. I've arranged for you to meet the family, Evelyn said, leading them through corridors that seemed to go on forever. Just a few people today, my daughter Patricia and her husband Gerald. They're eager to meet you both. Ethan's stomach tightened at Gerald's name, but he kept his expression neutral. They entered a sitting room where two people waited. Patricia Rothwell Sterling was in her late 60s, well-preserved and elegant in the way that required money and effort. Her husband Gerald was perhaps a decade younger, impeccably dressed, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of wielding power. Patricia, Gerald. This is my great-grandson Ethan and his daughter Olivia. Patricia approached with a careful smile, her eyes evaluating. The resemblance to Christopher is remarkable. Welcome to the family, Ethan. Gerald extended his hand, his grip firm and measured. This is quite extraordinary. We'd given up hope years ago of ever solving the mystery of what happened to Christopher. And here you are, living proof that he had a life beyond what we knew. My mother didn't talk about him, Ethan said carefully. I didn't know any of this existed until a few weeks ago. How extraordinary that must have been, Gerald said smoothly. To discover an entire heritage you never knew you had. I imagine there's quite a lot to adjust to. They sat for tea, actual formal tea with proper china and small sandwiches that Olivia examined with fascination. The conversation was polite but stilted, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious questions. Finally, Patricia addressed the elephant in the room. There are legal matters to discuss, of course. Inheritance, estate planning, your rights as Christopher's heir. Our family attorney will need to meet with you. I'm not here for money, Ethan said. Nevertheless, there are legal realities that must be addressed. Gerald's tone was pleasant but firm. Christopher's estate has been in probate for 25 years. With your confirmation as his son, certain assets will transfer to you, including shares in Rothwell Industries, Shah's. Christopher owned 18% of the company when he disappeared. Those shares have been held in trust, accruing value. They're yours now. Gerald smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're a stakeholder in the family business, Ethan. That comes with both privileges and responsibilities, Evelyn interrupted. Let's not overwhelm him on his first visit. There's plenty of time to discuss business matters, but Gerald continued, undeterred. Of course. Though time is somewhat pressing, we have a board meeting next month where several important votes will take place. It would be beneficial to understand your position on company matters before then. I don't know anything about running a company, Ethan said. Naturally. Which is why most stakeholders in your position would assign a proxy to vote on their behalf. I'd be happy to serve in that capacity, as I did during the probate period. It would simplify matters considerably. Ethan heard the careful manipulation in Gerald's words, the assumption that he'd be too overwhelmed or ignorant to want actual control. I'd prefer to understand what I'm voting on before I give anyone that power. Something flickered in Gerald's eyes. Annoyance, maybe concern. Of course. Very prudent. The rest of the visit passed in a blur of introductions to staff, a tour of the grounds that left Olivia speechless, and increasingly uncomfortable small talk. Gerald watched Ethan throughout with an expression of benign interest that felt calculated. Patricia warmed slightly to Olivia, showing her Christopher's childhood room, preserved exactly as he'd left it, which struck Ethan as both touching and deeply unsettling. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn drew Ethan aside. I have something for you. She handed him a manila envelope. Your original birth certificate and some sealed court records. Your mother legally changed both your names when you were 6 months old. Her real name was Caroline Ashby, not Morris. Ethan opened the envelope, staring at the documents. There it was in black and white. His birth name had been Ethan Christopher Rothwell. His mother had erased that identity completely, creating new paperwork, new history. The level of planning and fear required for such an act spoke volumes. Why would she go to such lengths? He asked. Fear, Evelyn said simply. She was terrified, and perhaps she had reason to be. On the drive home, Olivia chattered excitedly about the house, the gardens, the room that had belonged to the grandfather she'd never met. But Ethan barely heard her. His mind was on Gerald's careful words, on the business shares that apparently made him a threat to established power structures, on his mother's desperate flight with a 6-month-old baby. Christopher had been investigating Gerald's business deal. Then Christopher disappeared. Caroline had hidden for 30 years. Now Ethan had emerged with legal rights that could disrupt Gerald's control of the company. The pieces were fitting together into a picture that terrified him. The family attorney, Mr. Bancroft, was nothing like Ethan expected. Instead of the slick corporate type he'd imagined, Bancroft was in his early 70s, slightly rumpled, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. They met at his office downtown, a space filled with law books and family photographs that suggested a life beyond billable hours. Mr. Morris, or should I say Mr. Rothwell. Ethan is fine. Bancroft smiled. Very well, Ethan. I've been the Rothwell family attorney for 40 years. I knew your father, though not as well as I wish I had. He was a good man in a complicated situation. Over the next 2 hours, Bancroft walked Ethan through the labyrinth of his inheritance. Christopher's trust fund, held in probate, was worth $8 million. The family shares in Rothwell Industries represented 18% of a company valued at over $2 billion. There were properties, investments, accounts that had been frozen for decades, waiting for an heir to claim them. This is insane, Ethan said, his head spinning. I drive a 15-year-old truck. My daughter and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. And you're telling me I'm worth, conservatively, $360 million. Possibly more, depending on various factors. Ethan felt the room tilt. I don't know what to do with that information. You don't have to do anything immediately. But there are decisions that will need to be made, particularly regarding the company shares. Bancroft pulled out a folder. Mr. Sterling has requested that you sign over proxy voting rights to him. He's been managing those shares during the probate period. What was he doing with them? Voting them as he saw fit, which, given his position as CEO, means consolidating his own power. Bancroft's expression was carefully neutral. You should know that your 18%, combined with Mrs. Rothwell's 12% and a few other minority shareholders, could effectively check Mr. Sterling's control. He currently holds 35% personally. Without your proxy, he no longer has an automatic majority. So me showing up is a problem for him. Let's say it's an inconvenience. Bancroft leaned back in his chair. Ethan, I'm going to speak plainly. Your father came to me 32 years ago with concerns about a business deal Mr. Sterling was pursuing. He believed there were irregularities, possibly fraud. He was planning to go to the authorities. I read about that in his journal. Then he disappeared before he could follow through. The deal went forward. Mr. Sterling consolidated power, and the matter was never investigated beyond the initial police inquiry into Christopher's disappearance. You think Gerald had something to do with what happened to my father? Bancroft was quiet for a long moment. I think there were financial incentives for Christopher not to interfere with that deal. I think the timing of his disappearance was convenient for certain parties. But I have no proof, and as an officer of the court, I cannot make accusations without evidence. But you're telling me this anyway. I'm telling you to be careful. You're asking questions, asserting rights, disrupting an equilibrium that's been in place for 3 decades. That makes some people nervous. Bancroft's eyes were serious behind his glasses. Your mother understood that. She protected you the only way she knew how, by erasing your connection to all of this. Ethan left the meeting with a briefcase full of documents and a head full of suspicions. That evening, unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, he did something that felt slightly paranoid, but increasingly necessary. He hired a private investigator. The investigator, a former police detective named Russell Kent, listened to Ethan's story without interruption, taking occasional notes. When Ethan finished, Kent sat back in his chair. "You want me to look into a 32-year-old disappearance that's been investigated by the police, private detectives, and probably the FBI, given the family's wealth. I want you to look at Gerald Sterling. His finances around that time, his movements, anything that connects to my father's disappearance. That's a tall order. Paper trails go cold, people's memories fade. My mother ran from something. She changed our names, spent her whole life looking over her shoulder. I need to know what scared her badly enough to do that." Kent studied him. "This isn't just curiosity, is it? You think you might be in danger. I think I'm asking questions that someone might not want answered. And I have a 7-year-old daughter to protect. All right, I'll see what I can find. But this will take time, and it won't be cheap. Money's apparently not a problem anymore," Ethan said with bitter irony. 3 days later, Kent called with preliminary findings. They met at a diner far from both the warehouse and the Rothwell estate, somewhere anonymous and public. "Your father's disappearance coincided with a major acquisition vote," Kent said, sliding a folder across the table. "Sterling wanted to acquire a manufacturing company called Meridian Industries. The deal was worth $500 million at the time. But there were questions about Meridian's financial health, rumors of cooked books, inflated assets. And Christopher opposed it. According to board minutes I managed to access, Christopher requested an independent audit before the vote. Sterling argued it would delay the deal and cost them the opportunity. The board was split," Kent tapped the folder. 3 days after your father disappeared, the board voted unanimously to proceed without the audit. Sterling cast Christopher's proxy votes in favor. That's convenient. Gets better. 2 years after the acquisition, Meridian's accounting irregularities came to light. The SEC investigated, fined Rothwell Industries, but by then, the companies were fully integrated. Sterling claimed he'd been misled by Meridian's executives. Some people went to jail, but Sterling came out looking like a victim of fraud rather than a participant. Ethan's hands clenched on his coffee cup. He knew. That's what Christopher must have discovered. Gerald knew about the fraud and pushed the deal through anyway. Possibly. But proving it 32 years later will be nearly impossible. The key witnesses are dead or have no reason to talk. Sterling's covered his tracks well. What about my father's car? It was found by a river, right? Abandoned, keys in the ignition, no signs of struggle. Police theorized suicide or that he walked away from his life. But his body was never found, and there was no financial activity on his accounts after that day, because he was dead. Kent didn't disagree. I'll keep digging, see if I can find anyone from that time who might talk. But Ethan, if Sterling did arrange something to happen to your father, and if he knows you're investigating, you need to be very careful. That night, Ethan lay awake long after Olivia was asleep, staring at the ceiling. Gerald Sterling had motive. Christopher was threatening to expose fraud that would have destroyed his career and probably landed him in prison. He had opportunity, access to resources, connections, the kind of power that could make problems disappear. And he'd benefited enormously from Christopher's disappearance, spending 3 decades building an empire on a foundation that included that fraudulent Meridian deal. But knowing it and proving it were different things. And even if Ethan could prove it, what then? Gerald had lawyers, money, influence. He'd weathered an SEC investigation. What chance did Ethan have? His phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Gerald is pressuring me to convince you to sign the proxy. Says it's for the good of the company. I'm stalling but wanted you to know." Ethan stared at the message. Gerald was making his move, trying to lock down Ethan's voting rights before he could become a real threat. Which meant Gerald saw him as a threat. He texted back, "Thank you for the warning. Don't sign anything on my behalf. I need to understand what I'm dealing with first." Another text arrived seconds later. "Be careful. Ethan, I'm beginning to fear I've put you in danger by bringing you back into this family." Ethan got out of bed and checked on Olivia, watching her sleep peacefully. unaware of the web of corporate intrigue and possible murder surrounding their newly discovered heritage. He'd spent 7 years protecting her from poverty and instability. Now he had to protect her from something far more dangerous, a man who'd possibly killed once to protect his secrets and might do so again. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He called Bancroft and told him to schedule a meeting with the full board of Rothwell Industries. If Gerald wanted to know where Ethan stood, he'd find out. But it would be on Ethan's terms, in a public setting where actions were recorded and witnessed. "Are you sure about this?" Bancroft asked. "It will force Gerald's hand." "Good," Ethan said. "Let's see what he does when he can't control the narrative." As he hung up, Ethan caught sight of the corporate share documents Bancroft had given him, sitting on his kitchen table next to Olivia's homework. These pieces of paper represented power. The power to disrupt Gerald's control, to ask uncomfortable questions, to demand accountability for what happened 32 years ago. His mother had run from this power, understanding it came with danger, but she'd also spent her last words warning him to stay hidden, stay safe. Now, by accepting his inheritance and asserting his rights, Ethan was doing the opposite. He was stepping directly into the light, making himself visible to whatever forces had destroyed his father. The question was whether he was brave enough or foolish enough to see it through. The call came at 7 in the morning, 3 days before the scheduled board meeting. Bancroft's voice was tight with urgency. "Ethan, I need to see you today, now if possible. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you years ago." They met at Bancroft's home rather than his office, a modest Victorian in an older neighborhood. The attorney looked as if he hadn't slept, his usual careful composure replaced by evident distress. "I've carried this secret for 32 years, Bancroft said, leading Ethan into his study. "Your father made me promise, made me swear, not to reveal it unless 2 specific conditions were met. First, that he was confirmed dead or missing for at least 25 years. Second, that his child was found and confirmed through DNA. Ethan's heart hammered. "What are you talking about?" Bancroft went to his safe, entering a combination with shaking hands. He withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, and handed it to Ethan. "This is from your mother. Christopher gave it to me the day before he disappeared, with explicit instructions about when and how it should be opened. The envelope was addressed in a woman's handwriting. 'To my son, if he ever needs the truth.'" Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in his mother's careful script. He began to read, and the room seemed to fall away. "My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. Christopher never made it to the cabin where we planned to meet. He's gone, and I had to make impossible choices to keep you safe. I need you to understand what happened, what we discovered, and why I had to erase our entire existence. Your father wasn't paranoid. He was right. For months before he disappeared, he'd been investigating irregularities in a business deal Gerald was pushing through. What he found was worse than simple fraud. Gerald had been systematically embezzling from Rothwell Industries for years, using complex shell companies and falsified records. The Meridian acquisition was meant to hide these thefts, mixing legitimate business with stolen assets until they were impossible to separate. Christopher had evidence. Documents, recordings, proof of Gerald's crimes. He was going to the FBI the day after we were supposed to meet. He'd arranged everything. Immunity for cooperation, protection for our family, the whole thing. But the night before we were to leave, Christopher went back to the estate one last time. He needed additional files from his home office, documentation he'd hidden there. He told me he'd be at the cabin by midnight. He never arrived. I waited until dawn. Then I saw the news. Christopher's car found abandoned by the river. Police were calling it a possible suicide. I knew better. I knew Gerald had discovered what Christopher was planning. I knew my husband was dead. I also knew I had to protect you. Gerald would tie up loose ends. If he knew Christopher had a wife and child who might possess evidence, we'd be targets. So I ran. I took you barely 6 months old and I disappeared. The evidence Christopher gathered is still hidden. He gave me the location before he went back that last time. Made me memorize it in case anything happened to him. It's in a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. Box number 847. The key is... Ethan stopped reading and turned the page. But there was something else, a small brass key taped to the back of the letter. His hands shook as he continued. The key is here. The box is registered under a false name Christopher created. Jonathan Ashby. My maiden name, his middle name. If you're reading this, the 25-year time limit I discussed with Mr. Bancroft has passed. The box should still be accessible. In that box, you'll find everything. Financial records, audio recordings of Gerald making threats, emails, transaction records. Everything needed to prove what Gerald did and why Christopher died. But Ethan, my son, you need to understand what using this evidence will mean. Gerald Sterling is powerful. He's had 30 years to consolidate control, to build influence and wealth. Going after him with this information will make you a target. It will destroy the life I tried so hard to give you, a quiet, safe, anonymous life. I don't know what the right choice is. Part of me wants to tell you to burn these pages, forget everything, live safely in the obscurity I created for you. But another part knows that your father died seeking justice, seeking truth. He believed in doing what was right, even when it cost everything. The choice is yours. You can walk away from all of this, the money, the family, the danger, or you can finish what Christopher started. Either way, know that you were loved. Know that every choice I made, every lie I told, every time I moved us in the night, was because I couldn't bear to lose you the way I lost him. Stay safe, my sweet boy. Or if you can't stay safe, at least stay true to who you are. All my love. Mom. Ethan finished reading and sat in stunned silence. His mother had known everything. She'd carried the secret for 25 years, died with it still locked inside her. The fever dreams he'd dismissed as illness, stay hidden. Stay safe had been her final attempt to warn him. She knew where the evidence was all this time, he said finally. Yes. Bancroft's voice was heavy. Christopher made arrangements with me and separately with your mother. If anything happened to him, she was to take you and disappear. The evidence would be preserved, locked away for 25 years, long enough for you to be grown, for the danger to have passed. Why didn't she go to the police herself? Fear. Gerald had connections everywhere, police, judges, politicians. Christopher believed the FBI was the only agency insulated enough from local corruption to investigate properly. Your mother, alone with an infant, couldn't risk approaching authorities that might be compromised. So she ran and she kept running. Ethan stood and paced the room, his mind racing. Gerald killed my father. He had him murdered to protect his embezzlement scheme. Almost certainly. Though proving murder will be harder than proving the financial crimes. Bodies create evidence. Financial records are cleaner. The statute of limitations. For most financial crimes, yes, it's passed. But not for all of them. And not for murder. Bancroft leaned forward. Ethan, if you retrieve that evidence and go public, several things will happen. Gerald will be investigated, possibly prosecuted. The company will face enormous scrutiny. Your family will be torn apart, and you and Olivia will be at the center of a media firestorm. And if I don't, then Gerald continues as he has for 3 decades. He controls the company, maintains his power, and the truth about your father dies with your generation. Ethan looked at the letter again, at his mother's handwriting. She'd given him a choice. But in describing his father's character, believing in doing what was right, even when it cost everything, she'd told him what she thought he should do. I need to get that evidence. Ethan said, I thought you might say that. I'll come with you. As Christopher's attorney, I have standing to access materials related to his estate. They went to the bank that afternoon. Ethan half expected the safety deposit box to be gone, emptied, destroyed somehow in the 3 decades since Christopher had hidden it. But when he presented the key and the name Jonathan Ashby, a clerk led them to the vault without issue. The box was smaller than Ethan expected, but heavy when the clerk lifted it out. They were taken to a private room, and when the door closed, Bancroft nodded to Ethan. Go ahead. Inside were multiple flash drives, folders of documents, and several cassette tapes, technology from another era, preserved against time. Ethan opened the first folder and saw spreadsheets covered in Christopher's handwriting with notes in the margins. Transferred to shell company Meridian Holdings. No corresponding asset. Theft. A pattern suggests systematic embezzlement since 1990. One of the flash drives was labeled in Christopher's handwriting. Gerald's threats, recorded conversations. He documented everything, Ethan whispered. Your father was thorough. He knew what he was risking by going against Gerald. He wanted to make sure the evidence would survive, even if he didn't. Bancroft's voice was thick with emotion. He was a brave man, Ethan. He died trying to do the right thing. Ethan picked up one of the cassette tapes. The label read, Gerald, explicit threat, 3 days before disappearance. We need to get this material to the authorities, Bancroft said. But Ethan, once we do, there's no going back. Gerald will know you have this. He'll know you're the one who exposed him. Good. Ethan's jaw was set. I want him to know. My father tried to do this quietly, tried to protect the family reputation, and he was killed for it. I'm not making that mistake. Then we need to move quickly and carefully. Federal prosecutors first. We'll need immunity agreements for you in exchange for cooperation. Then we'll need protection for you and Olivia. Protection. Ethan, a man who's killed once to protect these secrets won't hesitate to do so again, especially now when he has so much more to lose. Bancroft met his eyes gravely. The moment we move forward with this, you're in danger. Ethan spent the next 2 days in a blur of activity that felt surreal. Federal prosecutors reviewed Christopher's evidence with careful intensity, their expressions growing grimmer with each document. The recordings were damning. Gerald's voice, clear and unmistakable, making threats, discussing the embezzlement with casual arrogance, even joking about removing obstacles to his plans. This is prosecutable, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison told them. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, possibly conspiracy to commit murder depending on what else we uncover. Mr. Morris, you understand you'll need to testify? I understand. And you're aware that once we move forward, Mr. Sterling will know you're the source. He'll have access to the best defense attorneys money can buy, and they'll come after your credibility hard. Let them. Ethan's voice was steady. Everything I'm telling you is true, and the evidence speaks for itself. But first, Ethan had to ensure Olivia's safety. He called Mrs. Kowalski and explained, without revealing everything, that he needed to send Olivia away for a week or two, that there were family complications that might become unpleasant. You are in danger? Mrs. Kowalski asked bluntly. Possibly. I don't know, but I can't risk Olivia being anywhere near this. I have sister in Vermont, retired teacher. She would love company, and Olivia would be safe there. I can't ask you to... You don't ask. I offer. This is what family does. The hardest moment was explaining it to Olivia. She sat on his bed while he packed her suitcase, her face serious beyond her years. Is this about the rich family? She asked. Yes, sunshine. There are some grown-up, problems that need to be solved, and I need to know you're somewhere safe while I deal with them. Are you coming back? The question pierced him. Of course I am, I promise. This is just for a little while, just until things settle down. Dad. Her voice was small. I don't care about being rich. I just want us to be okay. Ethan pulled her into a hug, feeling her small body against his, and promised himself he'd get through this for her. We will be okay. I'm making sure of it. Mrs. Kowalski drove Olivia to Vermont the next morning. Ethan watched them leave, feeling the weight of her absence like a physical thing. Then he turned his attention to what came next. He met with Evelyn at her private residence, a smaller property she maintained separate from the main estate, away from Gerald's influence. When he showed her the letter and explained what he'd found, she aged before his eyes. I suspected, she whispered. God help me, I suspected, and I did nothing. I told myself there was no proof, that I couldn't believe my own son-in-law capable of murder. But I knew something was wrong. You couldn't have known for certain. Gerald was careful. Christopher was my grandson. I should have fought harder to find the truth." Her hand shook as she held Caroline's letter. "Your mother. She must have been so frightened, so alone. She survived. She kept me safe. That's what matters." Evelyn looked at him with fierce determination. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to trust me. The prosecutors are moving forward, but it will take time to build the case. In the meantime, Gerald can't know what's coming. He needs to think everything is normal. The board meeting is tomorrow. He's expecting you to either sign the proxy or make some minor objection he can smooth over. Then that's what I'll give him, right up until the moment the federal agents arrive." Evelyn's eyes widened. "You're going to have him arrested at the board meeting? The prosecutors want to do it in a controlled environment with witnesses. Gerald is a flight risk. He has resources to disappear if he suspects what's coming. The board meeting gives us everyone in one place, on record, with no advance warning. Patricia will be there, my daughter. She'll watch her husband arrested for murdering her nephew. I'm sorry, but she needs to know the truth too." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He reviewed the plan repeatedly, looking for flaws. Federal agents would be positioned outside the building. Bancroft would signal them when the moment was right. Ethan would present evidence of the fraud to the board, and before Gerald could respond or flee, the arrest would happen. It was neat, clean, and terrifying, because if something went wrong, if Gerald suspected, if he'd planned for this possibility, Ethan had no idea what the man might do. His phone buzzed at 2 a.m. A text from an unknown number. "You should reconsider your position. Family matters should stay private. Think about your daughter." Ethan's blood ran cold. Gerald knew, not everything maybe, but enough to be making threats. The mention of Olivia was deliberate, calculated to frighten him into backing down. He called Bancroft immediately. "Gerald just threatened me, mentioned my daughter specifically." "That was stupid of him. Forward me the text. It's evidence of witness intimidation." Bancroft's voice was calm but urgent. "Is Olivia secure?" "She's in Vermont. He doesn't know where." "Good. Don't respond to the text. Let him think he's rattled you. Tomorrow we end this." But sleep wouldn't come. Ethan paced his apartment, thinking about Christopher making this same decision 32 years ago, choosing truth over safety, justice over compromise. His father had paid the ultimate price for that choice. Now Ethan was following in those footsteps, and the weight of that legacy pressed down on him. He went to his nightstand and opened the wooden box, looking at his mother's photographs one more time. She'd spent her life running, hiding, protecting him from this moment, but she'd also left him the letter, left him the choice. "I'm finishing what Dad started," he told her photograph. "I hope that's what you wanted." Morning came grey and cold. Ethan dressed carefully. The one suit he owned, purchased for his mother's funeral 20 years ago and rarely worn since. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw Christopher's face looking back. The same eyes, the same determined set to his jaw. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Ethan arrived early, Bancroft at his side. Federal agents were already in position, invisible in the building's lobby and parking garage. Everything was ready. Gerald was already in the boardroom when they entered, looking confident and controlled. He smiled when he saw Ethan. "I'm glad you decided to come. I trust you've given thought to the proxy arrangement we discussed." "I've given it a lot of thought," Ethan said carefully. Patricia arrived next, then other board members, executives, and major shareholders, all settling into their seats with coffee and small talk. The room gradually filled until everyone was present. Evelyn was the last to arrive, taking her seat at the head of the table with quiet dignity. "Let's begin," she said. Evelyn called the emergency board meeting to order, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. 12 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, coffee cups and folders arranged before them. Gerald sat directly across from Ethan, his expression confident, bordering on smug. "Thank you all for making time on short notice," Evelyn began. "As you know, we've recently confirmed that my great-grandson, Ethan Morris, is the rightful heir to Christopher Rothwell's estate and shares in this company. Today, we need to address certain matters regarding those shares in the company's governance. Gerald leaned forward slightly. Before we proceed, I'd like to note that Mr. Morris and I have discussed a proxy arrangement that would allow experienced leadership to guide his votes while he familiarizes himself with company operations. I believe we have the paperwork ready to formalize. Actually, Ethan interrupted, his heart hammering but his voice steady. I won't be signing any proxy agreement. The room went silent. Gerald's smile tightened fractionally. I understand this is overwhelming, but surely you recognize that complex corporate decisions require expertise you don't yet possess. What I lack in corporate experience, I make up for in moral clarity. Ethan reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. I've discovered something that this board needs to know about. Something that's been hidden for 32 years. Gerald's expression shifted, calculation replacing confidence. Mr. Morris, if you have concerns about company operations, there are appropriate channels. My father had concerns about company operations. Christopher Rothwell discovered financial irregularities before he disappeared. He documented them carefully, and he was planning to go to the authorities. Ethan opened the folder, his hands steady now. He was going to expose systematic embezzlement and fraud. Patricia gasped. Other board members shifted uncomfortably. Gerald's face had gone carefully blank. These are serious accusations, Gerald said quietly, made about events from 3 decades ago by someone who wasn't even born when they allegedly occurred. I'd be careful about slander, Mr. Morris. It's not slander if it's true. Ethan slid copies of documents across the table. These are financial records my father compiled. They show a pattern of theft from company accounts, money moved through shell corporations, assets falsified to hide the embezzlement. Board members picked up the documents, scanning them with growing alarm. Gerald remained motionless, but Ethan saw the muscle jumping in his jaw. The Meridian Industries acquisition, Ethan continued, wasn't just about growth. It was about hiding stolen assets, mixing legitimate business with embezzled funds until they were impossible to separate. My father discovered this and opposed the deal. 3 days later, he disappeared. This is absurd, Gerald said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Christopher's disappearance was investigated thoroughly. The police found no evidence of foul play because they weren't looking for it. They thought he'd walked away from his life or committed suicide. They didn't know he'd been gathering evidence against you. Evelyn's voice cut through the tension. Gerald, is any of this true? Of course not. This is a desperate attempt by someone who wants to discredit me and seize control of the company. Gerald's eyes locked on Ethan. You show up out of nowhere, claim to be Christopher's son, and suddenly you're making wild accusations based on 30-year-old documents that could have been fabricated. They weren't fabricated. Bancroft stood, his normally mild demeanor replaced with steel. I can authenticate every document. Christopher gave me copies for safekeeping before he disappeared. Everything Mr. Morris is presenting is genuine. Patricia's face had gone pale. Mother, did you know about this? Not until recently, Evelyn said quietly. But I'm beginning to understand many things that never made sense before. Gerald pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. I don't have to listen to these baseless accusations. This meeting is... Sit down, Gerald. Evelyn's voice was cold. You don't control this board anymore. I have proxy votes, not Christopher's, not mine. And I suspect several other members will want to hear what else Mr. Morris has to say before they decide where their loyalties lie. She looked at her son-in-law with something like grief. So sit down and let's hear the rest of it. Gerald remained standing, his eyes darting between Ethan, the door, and the documents spreading across the table. Ethan could see him calculating, weighing options, considering escape routes. There's more, Ethan said. My father didn't just document the fraud. He recorded conversations, including several where you made explicit threats about what would happen if he interfered with the Meridian deal. Gerald's face finally showed genuine fear. You're lying. I have audio recordings of your voice threatening my father 3 days before he disappeared. I have documentation of embezzlement totaling over $100 million. And I have federal prosecutors who are very interested in all of it." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Gerald's hands clenched on the back of his chair, knuckles white. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Gerald moved toward the door. Bancroft raised his hand in a prearranged signal, and the boardroom doors opened. 2 federal agents stepped inside, their badges visible. "Gerald Sterling," one of them said. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Gerald Sterling's face drained of color as the federal agents approached. For a moment, Ethan thought he might actually run, but there was nowhere to go. The agents positioned themselves on either side of him, professional and implacable. "On what charges?" Gerald demanded, his voice tight. "Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud," Agent Morrison said. "We can discuss the details at the federal building." "You have the right to remain silent. This is outrageous." "I'll have your badges for this harassment." "Save it for your lawyer," the second agent said, producing handcuffs. Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This can't be happening." "Gerald, tell them this is a mistake." Gerald's eyes met his wife's, and for the first time, Ethan saw something crack in his facade. Not remorse exactly, but calculation, the realization that his carefully constructed life was collapsing and taking everyone around him down with it. "Patricia, listen to me. Did you do it?" Her voice broke. "Did you steal from the company? Did you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the worst possibility. "It was business," Gerald said. And the admission was almost casual, as if he were discussing a minor accounting discrepancy. "The company needed capital, needed growth. I made decisions that kept us competitive, that made us successful. Everything I did was for this family, for this legacy. Christopher was family," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "My grandson was family, and you destroyed him. He was going to ruin everything." Gerald's composure finally shattered, his voice rising. "He was going to go to the FBI with his evidence, destroy decades of work, tank the stock price, send us all into bankruptcy and scandal. He couldn't see the bigger picture. So you had him killed." Ethan spoke quietly, but the words cut through Gerald's outburst like a blade. The room went absolutely silent. Every board member stared at Gerald, waiting for his denial, his outrage at such an accusation. Instead, Gerald laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You can't prove that." "You'll never prove that." "Maybe not," Ethan said. "But the fraud charges will put you away for decades. And once investigators start looking closely at everything surrounding my father's disappearance, phone records, financial transactions, associates you employed back then, they'll find something. People like you always leave traces. People like me." Gerald's lip curled. "You mean people who built something, who made hard choices, who understood that success requires sacrifice. Your father was weak. He had everything handed to him, and he wanted to throw it away for some working-class girl and naive ideals about right and wrong." "That working-class girl was my mother," Ethan said, his voice hard. "And those naive ideals were called integrity. Something you clearly never understood." Patricia made a small, wounded sound. She looked at her husband as if seeing him for the first time, and what she saw broke something inside her. "You killed Christopher, my nephew. You killed him and let us grieve for 30 years, wondering, hoping—" "I did what needed to be done," Gerald said coldly, "and I'd do it again." Christopher was going to destroy everything our family built. Everything you've enjoyed for the past 3 decades, this company, this wealth, this position, exists because I made the hard choice he couldn't make. Agent Morrison stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, I strongly advise you to stop talking." But Gerald was past caring, past caution. 3 decades of secret guilt, or perhaps secret pride, had finally found an outlet, and the words poured out like poison. He thought he could threaten me, thought his evidence mattered more than the survival of Rothwell Industries. He was wrong. And his little wife, she was smart enough to run, smart enough to hide. She understood what happens to people who threaten this family's interests. "You're admitting to conspiracy, to commit murder," Bancroft said, his voice shaking. "In front of 12 witnesses." Gerald seemed to realize what he'd done. His eyes darted around the room, seeing the horrified faces, the board members who'd worked with him for years, now staring at him like a stranger. He looked at Patricia, whose tears were flowing freely now, her hand over her mouth in horror. "Patricia, you have to understand. Don't." She held up a hand, unable to look at him. "Don't say another word to me, ever." The agents moved then, handcuffing Gerald with practiced efficiency. As they led him toward the door, he stopped and looked back at Ethan. "You think you've won something here. You think justice matters. But all you've done is destroy your own family, tear apart the company that would have made you richer than you could imagine. Was it worth it? Was bringing me down worth losing everything?" Ethan met his eyes steadily. "My father died seeking the truth. My mother spent her life protecting me from monsters like you. Yes, it was worth it. Every single thing I've lost or will lose. It's worth it to see you answer for what you've done." Gerald smiled, a cold, bitter expression. "We'll see how noble you feel when the company collapses. When the scandal destroys the Rothwell name. When your daughter grows up knowing her father chose revenge over security. I chose justice over silence," Ethan said. "There's a difference." The agents led Gerald out, and the boardroom doors closed behind them with a final resounding click. In the silence that followed, no one moved. Patricia wept quietly, Evelyn sat frozen, and the other board members stared at the documents scattered across the table, evidence of decades of fraud, of one man's corruption, of a murder hidden for 32 years. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "This meeting is adjourned." 3 months later, Ethan stood in his new apartment. Not ostentatious, just 2 bedrooms in a better neighborhood, with a small backyard where Olivia could play. The move had been necessary after the media storm. After reporters camped outside their old building for weeks. After the story of Gerald Sterling's arrest became national news. The trial was still months away, but Gerald's attorneys had already signaled they'd seek a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, his boardroom confession recorded by multiple witnesses. He faced decades in federal prison, and the additional investigation into Christopher's death had uncovered enough circumstantial evidence to support murder charges. Though those would be harder to prove, Ethan hadn't watched the news coverage obsessively. He'd given one carefully prepared statement with Bancroft at his side, then stepped away from the cameras. The story would tell itself. He had more important things to focus on. "Dad, can I plant tomatoes here?" Olivia called from the backyard, pointing to a sunny corner. "Sure, sunshine. We can go to the garden center this weekend." She ran back inside, her earlier anxiety about the move fading as she claimed this new space as home. The past months had been hard on her. Confusion about why they'd had to hide, why their faces were on television, why strangers asked her questions at school. But children were resilient, and with Mrs. Kowalski's steady presence and Ethan's careful explanations, she was adjusting. The doorbell rang. Evelyn stood on the doorstep, dressed more casually than Ethan had ever seen her holding a box. "I brought something," she said. "If you'll have me." They sat at his small kitchen table, and Evelyn opened the box. Inside was a photo album, old and carefully preserved. "I've been going through family archives," she explained, putting together a proper history for Olivia. Not the sanitized version we showed at charity galas, but the real story. The good and the bad. She opened the album. The first page showed Christopher as a child, gap-toothed and grinning. Then as a teenager, serious and thoughtful. Then young adult photos, some with Evelyn, some with friends, and then, near the end, several of Christopher with Carolyn. Ethan's breath caught. He'd never seen photos of his parents together. Caroline was young, pretty, smiling with genuine happiness at Christopher's side. They looked like any young couple in love, unaware of the tragedy waiting in their future. She really loved him, Ethan said softly, and he loved her. Completely. Evelyn turned another page. "I've been thinking a lot about the choices we made back then, how our prejudice, our snobbery, helped create the circumstances that led to all of this. If we'd welcomed Caroline, supported their marriage, perhaps none of this would have happened. You can't know that. Gerald was already committing fraud. He would have seen Christopher as a threat regardless, perhaps. But Caroline wouldn't have felt she had to run. You wouldn't have grown up without family, without resources, without knowing where you came from. Evelyn's eyes glistened. I can't change the past, but I'd like to be part of your future if you'll allow it. Part of Olivia's future. On our terms, Ethan said gently. No expectations about who we should be or how we should live. We're not Rothwells in the way your family understands that name. I wouldn't want you to be. You're better than we ever were. Over the next hour, they made plans. Evelyn would visit weekly, getting to know Olivia genuinely, rather than showering her with gifts and expectations. The family trust would provide for Olivia's education and security, but Ethan had refused the bulk of his inheritance, asking instead that it be used to establish a foundation in Christopher and Caroline's names, supporting working-class families, funding education, helping people like his mother, who'd struggled alone. Patricia had reached out once, a tearful phone call apologizing for Gerald, for not seeing what he was, for the family's treatment of Caroline decades ago. Ethan had been kind but distant. Forgiveness would take time if it came at all. The company itself was under new management, an independent CEO brought in to clean up decades of Gerald's corruption. The stock had taken a hit, but the fundamentals were sound. Rothwell Industries would survive, transformed by scandal into something more accountable, more ethical. As for Ethan, he'd returned to work at the warehouse. His supervisor had welcomed him back with raised eyebrows and questions he didn't fully answer. The money existed in accounts he rarely accessed, providing security without changing who he fundamentally was. He still drove his old truck, still packed Olivia's lunches, still helped Mrs. Kowalski with her heavy grocery bags. That evening, after Evelyn left and Olivia was doing homework, Ethan stood in his small backyard watching the sunset. He thought about his father who'd died seeking truth, about his mother who'd survived by hiding it, about the choice he'd made to expose everything, consequences be damned. Gerald had asked if it was worth it. Standing here now, in this modest life he'd chosen to keep despite the wealth available to him, Ethan knew the answer. His phone buzzed. A text from Olivia, who was too young for a phone, but had convinced him she needed one for safety. Come inside. I made us cookies. Well, Mrs. K helped. Okay, she made them. But I watched. Ethan smiled and headed toward the house, toward the warm kitchen and his daughter's laughter, toward the simple life his parents had wanted for him. They'd paid terrible prices for that life, his father with his life, his mother with decades of fear and loneliness. But they'd succeeded. They'd kept him safe, kept him good, kept him grounded in what mattered. The Rothwell fortune existed in the background now, a safety net rather than a defining characteristic. The family name carried scandal, but also finally truth. And Ethan carried forward both his father's courage and his mother's love, building a life that honored them both. In the kitchen, Olivia held up a slightly misshapen cookie with pride. It's shaped like a turtle. For your sea turtle project, remember? It's perfect, Ethan said, pulling her into a hug, and standing there in his modest kitchen, holding his daughter with the photo album of his parents, love sitting nearby and the future spread out before. At them, uncertain but honest, Ethan knew he'd made the right choice. Some inheritances were worth more than money, truth, justice, family bonds built on authenticity rather than obligation. Those were the things his parents had really left him, and those were the things he'd pass on to Olivia. The crescent birthmark on his wrist caught the evening light, the mark that had started everything. But it was just a mark now, not a burden or a secret. Just a reminder of where he came from and how far they'd all traveled to reach this moment of peace.